They thought death could erase everything. They were wrong. I stood there in front of my parents' grave, the Boston wind cutting through my black coat, and I didn't cry, not a single tear. Everyone probably expected me to break down, to collapse in grief like a dutiful daughter should, but all I felt was a cold, crystalline clarity. My father and mother were gone, victims of what the police called a tragic accident. But standing there, looking at those 2 fresh headstones, I knew the truth. Their deaths couldn't erase what they'd done to me. If anything, it made everything worse. My name is Anna Volkov, and I'm 32 years old. I built a construction empire from nothing, from bloody knuckles and sleepless nights, from concrete dust in my lungs and equations scribbled at 3 in the morning. I'm the CEO of Volkov Construction, one of the most respected architectural firms in New England. People see me and they see success. They see the tailored suits, the confidence, the woman who commands a room full of contractors twice her age without breaking a sweat. What they don't see is the cost. What they don't see is the family that bled me dry while smiling to my face. I remember standing in my darkened office 3 days before the funeral, the only light coming from my computer screen. Numbers glowed in the darkness, spreadsheets detailing years of payments, loans, emergencies that were never really emergencies. I was building something, but it wasn't a construction project. It was a reckoning. I allowed myself a small smile as I saved the file, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I don't make threats, I make promises, and I always keep them. After the funeral, the mask came off. Not mine, theirs. The lawyer's office smelled like furniture, polish, and old money, that distinctive scent of mahogany and leather that's supposed to make you feel like important things happen here. I sat in one of those high-backed chairs, the kind that makes you sit up straight whether you want to or not. Across from me was my brother Julian, 30 years old and still carrying himself like the golden boy he'd always been. He was fidgeting with his expensive watch, the one I'd later learn my parents bought him for his last birthday. $2,500 for a watch. I got a phone call and a promise to do lunch sometime. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, was one of those efficient types who probably rehearsed this speech in the mirror. He cleared his throat and began reading. I expected formalities. I expected the usual division of assets between 2 adult children. What I didn't expect was complete and total annihilation. Everything went to Julian. Every single thing. The house in Cambridge, worth at least $800,000. The vacation property in Cape Cod. The life insurance policies, $250,000 each. My father's investment portfolio. My mother's jewelry collection. The family business. The small consulting firm my father had built. Bank accounts, retirement funds, even the car I'd assumed would be mine, since I was the one who'd been driving my mother to her appointments for the last 2 years. And me? I got a yellowed cookbook that had belonged to my grandmother and a shoebox of baseball cards from the 1,980 seconds, most of them bent and worthless. My name wasn't just absent from the important parts of the will. It was like I'd been systematically erased, written out of my own family's story. I sat there, my hands gripping the armrests, and I couldn't find words. The lawyer kept talking, something about personal items and sentimental value, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Julian finally spoke, and there was something ugly in his smile. Well, it's not like you need it, right, Anna? You've got your whole empire going. I turned to look at him, really look at him, and I saw what I'd always refused to see before. He wasn't just careless or immature, he was entitled, down to his bones. He believed he deserved everything that fell into his lap, and he believed I deserved nothing because I'd had the audacity to succeed without help. But he wasn't even the worst part. The lawyer pulled out a letter, handwritten by my father in the weeks before his death. He read it aloud, and every word was a knife. Anna has always been strong and independent. She built her own life and never needed us the way Julian does. We know she'll understand that her brother needs security more than she does. Her success is proof that she can handle anything. We're counting on her strength. My success was proof that I could be abandoned. My strength was permission for them to take everything and give it to my brother. They'd turned my accomplishments into justification for my own disinheritance. I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Every eye in the room turned to me, but I didn't care. I grabbed my briefcase and slammed it on the table hard enough that Julian actually flinched. "You want to know what you really left me?" I said to the empty air, to my dead parents who couldn't hear me anymore. "You left me clarity. You left me permission to stop pretending. You left me free." I walked out of that office, and I didn't look back. Behind me, I heard Julian say something to the lawyer, probably some excuse about my emotional state. Let them think I was hysterical. Let them think I was having a breakdown. I wasn't breaking down. I was breaking free. The drive back to my office was a blur. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I kept seeing flashes of my childhood, my adolescence. Every moment I'd convinced myself I was imagining the favoritism. But I hadn't imagined any of it. Growing up, I was the responsible one. I was the one who studied until my eyes burned. Who made honor roll every semester? Who worked 3 part-time jobs to help with expenses? Julian was the charming one, the athlete, the social butterfly who could talk his way out of anything. When I graduated as valedictorian of my high school class, my parents took me to Applebee's and gave me $50. It was a Tuesday night. My mother ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and spent dinner reminding me to be humble about my achievements. 2 weeks later, Julian's baseball team won a regional tournament, and my parents threw a party that must have cost $3,000. There were fireworks. Actual fireworks in our backyard at midnight, and the neighbors complained, but my father just laughed and said his son was a champion. I told myself it wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the enthusiasm, the joy, the way they lit up when they talked about Julian but merely nodded when I brought home another perfect report card. My achievements were acknowledged. His were celebrated. There's a universe of difference between those two things. College was worse. I got a full academic scholarship to Boston University, but it didn't cover everything. I worked 40 hours a week on top of a full course load. I served coffee at a campus cafe from 5 to 9 in the morning. I shelved books at the library on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. On weekends, I worked for my uncle's construction company, learning the trade from the ground up, literally covered in drywall dust and paint. I studied accounting at 2 in the morning because that was the only time I had. I learned structural engineering at 6 because the library opened early and I could get 2 hours in before my coffee shop shift. Hunger became fuel when nobody offered to feed you. I learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and protein bars. I learned to smile when professors asked if everything was okay, because what was I going to say? That my parents paid for my brother's private university, his apartment, his meal plan, his spring break trips? While I was eating ramen in my dorm room and doing homework by the light of a stolen candle because I'd been too broke to pay the electricity bill, Julian went to a private college that cost $60,000 a year. He majored in business administration and graduated with a 2.8 gigapascals. He never worked a day while he was in school. My parents covered every single expense without hesitation. When I asked once if they could help with my textbooks, books that cost $800 for a single semester, my father said, "You're doing fine on your own, Anna. Julian's not as self-sufficient as you are. He needs our support more." Self-sufficiency became my punishment. The better I did, the less I deserved. It was perverse logic, but it was their logic, and I was trapped in it. Sunday dinners were the worst. Every week, we'd gather at my parents' house in Cambridge, and every week it was the Julian show. He always had some new business idea, some scheme that was definitely going to make him a millionaire. My parents would lean in, fascinated, asking questions and offering suggestions. When it was my turn to share, when I talked about landing a major contract or finishing a complex project, they'd nod politely. "That's nice, dear," my mother would say, and then immediately turn back to Julian. "So tell us more about this sports memorabilia concept." My accomplishments were mentioned and then dissolved, washed away with the dinner dishes and forgotten by dessert. Julian's fantasies were treated like prophecies. It would have been funny if it hadn't been my entire life. Then came the first financial crisis. Julian wanted to open a sports memorabilia store. He'd been out of college for 2 years, drifting between part-time jobs and big ideas. This time, he was sure he'd found his calling. He needed capital. $75,000 to lease a space, buy inventory, and get started. I was sitting at that Sunday dinner when he pitched it to my parents. I watched their faces transform, watched them get swept up in his enthusiasm. They didn't have that kind of cash lying around, but they didn't let that stop them. They took out a second mortgage on their house to fund Julian's dream. I remember driving home that night, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, because nobody had asked me. Nobody had considered that maybe I had ideas, that maybe I could use support too. I was 26 years old and I'd just secured my first major independent contract, enough money to rent a real office instead of working from my apartment. But that wasn't a dream worth mortgaging a house for. That was just Anna being Anna, quietly successful and completely ignorable. Julian's store lasted 8 months. 8 months of my parents' money burning through inventory that never sold, a lease on a location that was too expensive, and my brother's complete lack of business acumen. When it finally collapsed, when he was $60,000 in debt and the store was closed, my parents called it bad timing, market conditions, the economy, never Julian's fault. Never his lack of planning or his refusal to listen to anyone's advice, least of all mine. They asked me to help. Not asked, really. Expected. My mother called me at work one afternoon, her voice tight. "Anna, honey, we need to talk about Julian's situation. He's really struggling, and you know how family helps family." I helped. I always helped. I wrote a check for $15,000 to keep the creditors from taking legal action. It was money I'd been saving for new equipment, money I needed to expand my business. I wrote it anyway, because what else could I do? They were my family. Julian was my brother. And maybe, some pathetic part of me thought, if I helped enough, they'd finally see me. They'd finally appreciate me. They didn't. They cashed the check and never mentioned it again. Then my father got sick. He needed emergency surgery, something wrong with his heart that the doctors caught just in time. The surgery cost $32,000, even with insurance. My parents didn't have that kind of money, not with the second mortgage they'd taken out for Julian's failed business. So I paid for it. I paid for the surgery, for the follow-up care, for the medications and the physical therapy. I depleted my business savings. I slept on the couch in my office for 3 months because I couldn't afford rent on my apartment anymore. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and told myself it was temporary. My mother visited me in the hospital after the surgery, found me in the cafeteria drinking bad coffee because I'd been there for 16 hours straight, making sure everything went smoothly. She hugged me and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. It's just what daughters do, taking care of family. Just what daughters do. Not a sacrifice. Not an extraordinary gesture. Just my job, my role, the thing I existed to provide." I nodded and smiled because that's what you do when someone has just thanked you, even if the thanks feels empty. Gratitude came and went, but expectations stayed. They moved in like a permanent house guest, setting up camp in every corner of my life. A few months after my father recovered, my mother called about property taxes. She was worried they were going to lose the house because they'd fallen behind. It wasn't entirely untrue. They were behind, though not as dramatically as she made it sound. But I didn't question it. I set up an automatic transfer of $2,800 every single month. No contract, no agreement about when it would end, just a standing order from my account to theirs. I took on extra projects to cover it. I worked 16-hour days and convinced myself I was building something for the future, for my own security. Really, I was funding theirs, blood and bank accounts. That was the nature of our relationship. They held the former over me while draining the latter. For 3 years, I paid $2,800 a month. That's over $100,000, money that vanished into the black hole of my family's hands. I never asked questions because I thought I knew where it was going. Property taxes, utilities, food, the basic costs of keeping my aging parents happy. And then I sat in that lawyer's office and learned the truth. The property taxes weren't the problem. They'd taken out another mortgage, this one for $275,000, to fund Julian's second business venture, a sports bar. An upscale sports bar, he'd called it, with craft beer and gourmet bar food and massive televisions. My $2,800 a month wasn't paying property taxes. It was covering the mortgage payment on my brother's second attempt at entrepreneurship. They'd lied to me for 3 years. They'd looked me in the eye, month after month, and told me they needed help with basic expenses while they were actually subsidizing Julian's dream. Again. Still. I sat in my car in the parking garage after that lawyer's appointment, and I couldn't move. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel, and I was shaking, not crying. Just shaking with a rage so pure and cold it felt like I'd been plunged into ice water. Every memory was recontextualizing itself. Every time I'd cut back, every time I'd sacrificed, every time I'd told myself it was temporary and it would get better, it was all a lie. They'd been lying to me for years, and I'd been too desperate for their approval to see it. I drove home in a daze. I barely remember the route. I walked into my apartment, my beautiful apartment that I'd finally been able to afford again once my business stabilized, and I sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop, and I started to First, I canceled every automatic transfer. Every single one. The $2,800 the smaller transfers I'd set up for emergencies. The joint plan because she said she needed expenses. All of them. To this financial to 17 missed calls and 12 text messages, all variations on the same theme. How could I do this? How could I abandon them? There must be a bank error. Call us back right now. This is childish. This is cruel. You have a responsibility. I made myself coffee and I ignored all of them. Instead, I opened a new spreadsheet and I started documenting everything, every dollar I'd ever given them, every expense, every emergency, every request. I went back through 7 years of bank statements. I found receipts. I pulled up old emails where I'd confirmed transfers or payments. And I built a case, not for a court of law, but for the court of public opinion. Julian's first college education, the one my parents claimed they'd paid for entirely. I'd contributed $14,000 over 4 years. Books, a laptop, emergency funds when he overdrafted his account, which happened monthly. My father's surgery and recovery. $32,475. Every penny documented. Home repairs over the years, things my parents said they couldn't afford. New roof, foundation work, updated electrical. $20,050, all from my accounts. Julian's emergencies. And there were so many emergencies. Car accidents that were never his fault. Gambling debts he swore he'd never accumulate again. A DUI that required a lawyer. Almost $15,000 in bailouts, each one preceded by promises that this was the last time. The monthly transfers. 3 years at $2,800 a month. $100,800. To cover a mortgage I didn't know existed, for a business that was already failing. The total came to over $175,000. Nearly $200,000, if I included the interest I'd lost by depleting my savings and retirement accounts. That number sat on my screen, cold and undeniable. They called it love. They called it family obligation. But math doesn't lie. Math is the one thing in this world that can't be manipulated or reframed. I hadn't been a daughter. I'd been a resource. I saved that spreadsheet with a sense of grim satisfaction. Then I made 2 phone calls. First to David Chen, my financial advisor. David, I need you to help me separate and protect all my assets. Personal and business accounts need firewalls. I need to be completely financially independent of my family. He asked a few questions, heard the tone in my voice, and said he'd have it done by end of business day. That's why I paid him the big fees. He didn't argue or pry. Second call went to Lena Petrova, a lawyer I'd worked with on contracts and a woman who'd become a genuine friend over the years. Lena, I need advice on harassment and boundary setting. How do I protect myself legally from family members who won't take no for an answer? She invited me to lunch that same day, and over salads neither of us really ate, I told her everything. She listened, made notes, and when I finished, she looked at me with something like respect. Document everything, she said. Every call, every text, every interaction. If they escalate, we can pursue a restraining order if needed. But Anna, the best thing you can do is be completely consistent. Don't engage. Don't explain. Just maintain your boundaries like they're walls made of steel. That afternoon, I made one final call. I used my office line, not my personal cell, because I wanted this to be formal. My mother answered, and I could hear the relief in her voice. Anna, oh, thank God. We need to talk about this bank situation. There's no bank situation, I said, my voice level. I've canceled all automatic transfers. All financial support has ended. Silence. Then, what are you talking about? Anna, we have bills. Then pay them yourselves. I'm done. My father grabbed the phone. I heard the fumbling transfer. Anna Marie Volkov, this childish tantrum ends now. You have responsibilities to this family. I've fulfilled my responsibilities, I said. Multiple times over. I've documented every dollar, and if you'd like, I can send you the full accounting. $175,000, Dad. That's what I've given you over the last 7 years. How much of that went to Julian's failing businesses? How much of it was based on lies? We never lied to you, he blustered, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping in. The mortgage, I said softly. You told me you needed help with property taxes. You took out a $275,000 mortgage for Julian's sports bar and you let me pay it for 3 years without telling me. That's not a misunderstanding, Dad. That's fraud. Julian needed help, my mother said. She'd taken the phone back. He's not like you, Anna. He needs support. Then support him yourselves, I said. I'm done being the family ATM. Don't contact me again unless you're ready to apologize and have an honest conversation. Otherwise, consider this relationship on permanent pause. I hung up. My hand was shaking, but I'd done it. I'd drawn the line, carved it deep into stone, and I wasn't going to cross back over it. They didn't believe me at first. For the next week, my phone rang constantly. They left voicemails that ranged from concerned to furious. My mother cried on my answering machine, asking what she'd done wrong. How could I abandon them in their time of need? My father yelled, threatened, demanded. Julian sent text messages calling me a selfish bitch who'd always thought she was better than everyone else. I saved every message, I documented every call, and I didn't respond to a single one. Then they changed tactics. My mother started calling my colleagues and business partners. She was subtle about it at first, just reaching out to people she'd met at company events over the years, asking innocent-sounding questions. Is Anna okay? She seems stressed. Has she been making good decisions lately? I'm worried about her. She's been acting so strange. It was character assassination disguised as maternal concern, and it was insidious. Michael Torres, one of my senior project managers and a man I trusted completely, pulled me aside one afternoon. We were at a construction site, supposedly doing a routine inspection, when he asked if we could talk privately. We walked to the coffee shop across the street, and over espresso that neither of us really wanted, he told me what was happening. "Your mother called me last week?" he said. "She was asking if you seemed mentally unstable, if the stress of the business was making you irrational." "Anna, she's trying to undermine your professional reputation." I wasn't surprised, not really. When you refuse to play by someone's rules, they'll try to convince everyone else you're crazy. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her you were the most competent, level-headed person I'd ever worked with, and that if she had concerns, she should address them with you directly." He paused. "But Anna, you should know she's making these calls. She's contacted at least 3 other people I know of." I thanked him and went back to my office. That night, I did something I'd been putting off. I wrote a clear, factual summary of what had happened. The will, the years of financial support, the lies about the mortgage, the sudden cutoff, and the reasons behind it. I attached selected bank statements, enough to prove my point without revealing everything. Then I sent it to a carefully curated list of extended family members. My aunt, Emma, my mother's sister, who I'd always gotten along with, my cousins on both sides, a few family friends who'd known me since childhood. I didn't editorialize. I didn't beg for understanding. I just presented the facts and said, "I wanted you to hear this from me, in case you hear other versions. This is what happened, and these are the choices I've made going forward." The responses started coming in within hours. Aunt Emma called me, and I actually answered. She was quiet for a long moment after I confirmed everything in the email was true. Then she said, "Anna, honey, I had no idea. Your mother always talked about how successful you were, how proud they were. She never mentioned any of this." "They wouldn't," I said. "It doesn't fit their narrative." "I read your summary twice," she said. "I pulled out a calculator and checked your math. Anna, $175,000. That's not help. That's systematic exploitation." "I know," I said quietly. "What do you need from me?" she asked, and the simplicity of that question made my throat tight. "Not what's wrong with you, not how could you do this, just what do you need?" "I need people to know the truth," I said. "So when my mother calls them crying, they'll know there's another side to this story." "Consider it done," Aunt Emma said. "I'm calling everyone tonight." She did. Within 3 days, the family narrative had shifted. My cousins started reaching out, offering support. Some of them shared their own stories of my parents' favoritism, incidents I hadn't known about. The consensus was forming, and it wasn't in my parents' favor. Secrets can't survive sunlight, and I'd just thrown open every curtain. Meanwhile, my parents' financial situation was deteriorating rapidly. Without my monthly payments, they couldn't cover the mortgage on the house. They missed 1 payment, then 2. The bank sent formal notices. Julian's sports bar was struggling too. Turns out, running a business requires more than enthusiasm and family money. He was bleeding cash, working double shifts as a bartender at someone else's establishment just to keep his doors open. The irony wasn't lost on me. Then came the ambush at my construction site. I should have expected it, but I'd been naive enough to think they'd respect at least that boundary. I was inspecting a commercial renovation project in downtown Boston, talking with my foreman about some structural concerns, when I saw them approaching. My parents, looking older and more worn than I remembered. My father's face was red. My mother's eyes were puffy from crying. They dressed for effect, old clothes that made them look more vulnerable than they probably were. They made a scene. My mother started crying before she even reached me, loud enough that workers stopped what they were doing. My father's voice carried across the construction site. "Anna, please, we need to talk. You can't keep shutting us out. We're your parents." I felt the eyes of every worker on the site turn toward us. This was a power play, an attempt to use public shame to force my compliance. I took a deep breath and walked toward them, my face calm. "You need to leave," I said quietly. "This is a work site. You're not authorized to be here." "We just need 5 minutes." My mother pleaded. "Please, sweetheart. Julian's going to lose everything. The house is going into foreclosure. We made mistakes, but we're family." "You're family when it's convenient," I said. "You're family when you need money. But where was family when you wrote me out of your will? Where was family when you lied to me about the mortgage? Where was family every single time Julian got the celebration and I got the obligation?" My father stepped forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. "We're sorry about the will. We can change it. We made a mistake. But right now, we need your help. Julian needs your help." "No," I said simply. "You can't mean that," my mother said. "Anna, he's your brother." "He's a 30-year-old man who's never faced consequences for his actions," I said. "And you're both adults who made choices. You chose to mortgage your house for his business. You chose to lie to me. You chose to favor him at my expense for my entire life. Those are your choices, and these are your consequences." "We raised you better than this," my father said, and there was anger creeping into his voice now. "No," I said, "you raised me to be convenient." You raised me to be strong so you'd have an excuse to ignore me. You raised me to succeed so you could justify taking everything I earned. But you know what you didn't raise me to be? You didn't raise me to be a doormat. I learned that on my own. I turned to my foreman, who'd been watching the whole thing with a carefully neutral expression. Marcus, please call security. These people are trespassing. My mother gasped like I'd slapped her. My father's face went from red to purple. You wouldn't, he said. I would, I said, and I will. You have 2 minutes to leave before security arrives, and if you ever show up at one of my work sites again, I'll file for a restraining order. I don't make threats. I make promises. And I'm promising you this boundary is non-negotiable. They left. They didn't have a choice. Security arrived just as they reached the site entrance, and I watched them walk away, my father's hand on my mother's elbow, both of them looking back at me like I was a stranger. Maybe I was. Maybe that was the point. That night, I sat in my office long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights sparkled through my window, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet. But peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've finally stopped letting yourself be used. I pulled out the documentation I'd been compiling, all the receipts and bank statements and emails. I had it notarized the next day, dated and signed and made official. If they ever tried to tell a different version of this story, I had the truth, preserved and protected. I folded that fear into a small, silent square and filed it away with all my other tools I hoped I'd never need to use. The next few months were brutal, but they were clarifying. The mortgage foreclosure process moved forward. My parents tried calling me twice more, but I didn't answer. They sent emails that I archived without reading. Julian sent a long, rambling message about how I'd destroyed the family, how I was responsible for their suffering, how he'd always known I was selfish. I blocked him without responding. The extended family split into camps. Some people thought I'd gone too far. That family should forgive family no matter what. But more people, far more than I'd expected, reached out with support. Aunt Emma became a regular presence in my life, taking me to lunch once a week and just listening when I needed to talk. My cousin Rachel, who I hadn't been close to in years, sent me a long email about her own experience with our family's toxic dynamics. You did what I never had the courage to do. She wrote, you put yourself first. My business thrived. Without the constant financial drain, I was able to invest properly in equipment and staff. I took on bigger projects. I slept in my own bed every night and ate real meals. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. I'd forgotten what it felt like to work for my own future instead of someone else's present. 6 months after that scene at the lawyer's office, my parents' house sold in a short sale. They moved into a small apartment in a less expensive part of the city. Both of them had to find part-time work to supplement their retirement income. Julian's sports bar closed 3 months after that. He declared bankruptcy and moved back in with our parents, 3 adults crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment, living with the consequences of their own choices. I heard all this through the family grapevine. I didn't reach out. I didn't check on them. I maintained my boundaries like steel walls, exactly as Lena had advised. Then came the phone call I'd been half expecting and half dreading. It was from my mother's number, but Julian's voice on the other end. Anna? He said, and he sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before. We need to talk. Can we meet? I should have said no. I should have hung up. But something in his voice was different, stripped of the entitled confidence that had always characterized him. One meeting, I said. Public place. I choose the location. I picked an upscale restaurant in downtown Boston, the kind of place with white tablecloths and prices that would make a point. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table with a clear view of the entrance. When they walked in, all 3 of them, I barely recognized them. My father looked like he'd aged a decade. My mother's clothes were dated, worn. Julian had lost weight, his face drawn and pale. They sat down across from me, and nobody spoke for a long moment. The waiter came by, and I ordered a glass of wine. They ordered water. Even that felt like a message. Finally, my father spoke. Anna, he said, we've come to apologize. I sipped my wine and waited. My mother's hands were shaking on the table. We were wrong, she said, about everything. The will, the money, the way we treated you your whole life. We see that now. Julian sees it too. Julian wouldn't meet my eyes. I'm sorry, he said to the tablecloth. I took advantage. I let them give me everything, and I never questioned if I deserved it. And you paid the price. Yes, I said simply. I did. We want to make it right, my father said. We can't undo the will, obviously, but we can change how things are going forward. We need your help, Anna. We're barely making it. Julian's living with us. We can barely afford rent, and I know we have no right to ask, but you're the only one who can help us now. There it was, the real reason for the apology. They weren't sorry. They were desperate. Help you, how? I asked, my voice pleasant and casual. Do you need a loan? A monthly allowance? Should I pay off Julian's bankruptcy? Cover your rent? Where exactly would you like me to start bleeding for you again? Anna, please, my mother said. We know we hurt you, but we're family. Doesn't that mean something? I set down my wine glass very carefully. When I spoke, my voice was cold and clear. Family. Let me tell you what that word means to you. Family is when you need something. Family is when you're drowning and you need someone to pull you up. Family is a tool you use when the bank account runs dry. But when I needed family, when I was working 3 jobs and sleeping in my office and eating ramen for dinner, where were you? You were funding Julian's dreams. You were throwing parties for his mediocre achievements while mine were footnotes. You taught me that love is conditional, that approval must be earned over and over again, and that success is its own punishment. My mother started crying, real tears this time, not the performative kind. We didn't see it that way, she whispered. We thought you were strong enough not to need us. Strength isn't the absence of need, I said. It's what happens when your needs are ignored so consistently that you stop expressing them. You mistook my survival skills for preference. I didn't want to be independent. I was forced to be, and then you used that forced independence as justification to give everything to Julian. My father cleared his throat. What do you want from us, Anna? An apology? You have it. What else? I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope. I'd prepared it 2 months ago, updating it periodically, waiting for this moment. I knew it would come eventually. Desperation always does. I placed it on the table between us. Open it, I said. Julian reached for it first, his hands trembling slightly. He pulled out the contents, and his face went pale. Inside was a detailed accounting, the same spreadsheet I'd compiled months ago, but printed and notarized. $175,000 in support over 7 years. Below that was a second document, a list of every time they'd celebrated Julian and overlooked me, every party and gift and moment of favoritism, documented with dates and photographs I'd pulled from old albums and social media. The third document was a pamphlet for an addiction recovery center and a list of mental health resources. The fourth was a printed guide to employment services for people over 50, with several listings circled in red pen. And at the bottom, paper clipped to everything else, was a personal check. For $50, made out to all 3 of them. $50, I said as they stared at it. That's what you gave me when I graduated as valedictorian. When I achieved something you should have been proud of, something that actually mattered, you gave me $50 in dinner at Applebee's, so that's what I'm giving you now. $50. Use it however you want. Have a nice meal. Buy gas. I don't care. Anna, this isn't funny, my father said, his voice shaking with anger. You're absolutely right, I said. It's not funny at all. Do you want to know what your apology is worth to me? It's worth exactly what you taught me it was worth. $175,000, paid in full, and a lifetime of emotional neglect. The debt is settled. You don't owe me anything anymore. But more importantly, I don't owe you a single thing. My mother pushed the envelope away like it was burning her. This is cruel, she said. This isn't like you. No, I agreed. It's not like the me you created, the convenient daughter who wrote checks and swallowed her hurt and smiled through every slight. But that woman is gone. You killed her when you wrote that will. You buried her when you lied about the mortgage. This is who I am now, someone who knows her worth and who won't accept less than she deserves ever again. Julian finally looked up at me, and there was something broken in his eyes. What are we supposed to do? He asked, and he sounded genuinely lost. Anna, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix anything. For a moment, just a moment, I felt something soften inside me. He looked like a child, confused and scared. But then I remembered every time he'd smirked at my expense, every advantage he'd taken without question, every time he'd let me pay his way while treating me like I was less than. Sympathy died before it fully formed. You're supposed to figure it out, I said, the same way I did. You're 30 years old, Julian. You've had every advantage, every opportunity, and you've squandered all of them. The recovery center information is for you. The employment listings are for mom and dad. Those are my suggestions. What you actually do is your choice. But you'll do it without my money and without my labor. I'm not your safety net anymore. You're really going to let us lose everything? My father asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. Your own parents? Your own brother? You already lost everything, I said quietly. You lost it when you chose favoritism over fairness. You lost it when you chose lies over honesty. You lost it when you decided that I was strong enough not to need love. These consequences you're facing, they're not my doing. They're yours. I'm just refusing to shield you from them anymore. I stood up, leaving my half-finished wine on the table. I pulled out my wallet and placed $200 next to my glass. That covers my drink and your waters, with enough left over for you to order dinner. Eat something. I'm told the salmon is excellent, but this is the last meal I'm buying you. The last anything I'm giving you. Don't contact me again unless you're ready to have an honest conversation about how you destroyed your relationship with your daughter. And even then, I make no promises. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Behind me, I heard my mother sob, heard my father say something sharp and angry. I didn't turn around. I'd spent 32 years turning around, going back, giving in. Not anymore. The night air hit me as I stepped outside, cool and clean. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, letting the weight of what I'd just done settle over me. It didn't feel good, exactly. It felt necessary. It felt like cauterizing a wound, painful but cleansing. I walked back to my office, even though it was late, and I didn't have any work that couldn't wait until morning. I just needed the space, needed to be surrounded by something I'd built with my own hands and my own mind. My office had become a sanctuary, proof that I could create value and success without them, despite them. I sat at my desk and looked out at the Boston skyline, lights twinkling in the darkness. My phone buzzed once, a text from my mother. I didn't read it. I just turned the phone face down and left it there. The next few weeks were surprisingly quiet. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. I'd built my walls high enough that they finally understood they couldn't scale them. I heard through Aunt Emma that they'd taken the pamphlets I'd given them seriously. Julian had checked himself into an outpatient program, not for addiction, but for depression and life skills counseling. My parents had both found part-time work and were making their rent, barely, but making it. I felt nothing about this information. Not satisfaction, not guilt, not concern, just nothing. They'd become strangers who happened to share my DNA, and strangers' problems weren't mine to solve. My life expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without the constant drain of family drama, I had energy for other things. I started dating again, casually at first, then more seriously. I met someone, a structural engineer named Marcus, who understood the demands of my work because he lived them too. We didn't rush anything, but it felt healthy in a way nothing had felt healthy in years. I invested in my friendships, the ones I'd neglected while I was busy being the family ATM. Dinner parties and weekend trips and long conversations over wine. People who chose to be in my life rather than feeling entitled to my resources. The difference was revelatory. I bought a house, a beautiful brownstone in Back Bay that I renovated myself, hands-on, nights and weekends. Every wall I painted, every fixture I installed, felt like an act of reclamation. This was mine, only mine, built with money I'd earned and kept instead of giving away. 8 months after that dinner, I received a letter in the mail. My mother's handwriting, but neater than usual, like she'd taken time with it. I almost threw it away, unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. It was an actual apology. Not a request for money, disguised as remorse, but genuine acknowledgement of harm done. She wrote about going to therapy, about finally understanding the damage they'd caused. She wrote about how proud they actually were of me, how they'd always been proud but had never known how to show it in a way that didn't diminish Julian. She wrote about regret and shame and the painful process of looking at yourself clearly for the first time in decades. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't request forgiveness or reconciliation. She just said she was sorry, that she understood if I never wanted to speak to them again, and that she hoped I was happy. I read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer in my desk. I didn't respond. Not because I was still angry, but because I didn't know what to say. Sorry was a word, but words couldn't rebuild what they'd demolished. Maybe someday I'd be ready for a relationship with them. Something new and bounded by rules we all agreed to follow. But not yet. Maybe not ever. And I was okay with that uncertainty. 3 months after the letter, Julian called. I'd unblocked his number at some point, more out of indifference than forgiveness. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us. I almost said no, but something in his tone was different, humbler. So I agreed, choosing a cafe near my office during my lunch break, limiting the time frame, and keeping it in my territory. He was already there when I arrived, nursing a black coffee at a corner table. He'd changed too, thinner but in a healthy way, like someone who'd started taking care of themselves. He stood when I approached, awkward, like he wasn't sure if he should hug me or shake my hand. We settled for a nod. We sat in silence for a moment. I'd ordered my coffee, and I waited, sipping it, letting him figure out why he'd asked me here. I've been sober 4 months, he finally said. From alcohol. I didn't realize I had a problem until I couldn't use it as a crutch anymore. Congratulations, I said, and I meant it. Sobriety is hard work, regardless of who's doing it. I got a job, he continued. Nothing fancy. I'm managing a gym in Somerville. It's steady, and I'm good at it. I'm not going to be rich, but I'm paying my bills. Good, I said. I've been in therapy too, he said. Trying to figure out why I am the way I am, why I always expected everyone to save me. I didn't respond. This wasn't my confession to hear, and I wasn't going to make it easier for him by offering absolution he hadn't earned. The therapist asked me to make amends, Julian said, to the people I'd hurt. You're at the top of that list, Anna. A very long list, but you're at the top. I'm listening, I said. He took a breath. I spent my whole life thinking I deserved what I got because I was getting it. Mom and Dad gave me everything, so I must have earned it somehow. But I didn't. I was just there, and I was charming, and that was enough. Meanwhile, you were working yourself to death, and they barely noticed. I saw it. I knew it was unfair. I just didn't care because it benefited me. Yes, I said. You did. I took your money. I took your time. I took your emotional energy, and I gave you nothing back. I treated you like a bank. And worse, I resented you for being successful. Like somehow your success was an insult to my failure. He laughed, bitter. How messed up is that? Very, I agreed. I can't pay you back, he said. Not the money. I'm drowning in debt, barely making rent. But I wanted you to know that I see what I did now. I see what they did, and I'm trying to be different. I'm trying to be someone who earns what he gets and doesn't expect anyone to clean up his messes. I studied him across the table. He looked sincere, but sincerity was easy. Change was hard. What do you want from me, Julian? I asked. Nothing, he said, and he seemed surprised by his own answer. I guess I just wanted you to know that you were right, about everything, and that I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve the chance to ask for it, but I'm sorry. We sat there for a while longer. I finished my coffee. He finished his. We talked about small things, neutral things, his job at the gym, my latest construction project, the weather. Surface conversations that didn't hurt. When we parted ways, he didn't ask when we could meet again. He didn't ask for my forgiveness or my phone number. He just thanked me for my time and walked away, and I appreciated that more than anything else he could have done. I went back to my office and I thought about forgiveness. Not because I owed it to them, but because I was curious about what it would feel like. Would it be relief? Would it be healing? Or would it be another form of self-betrayal, letting them off the hook while the wounds they'd caused were still tender? I didn't have an answer. Maybe I never would. But I had something better than forgiveness. I had peace. I had boundaries that held. I had a life I'd built on my own terms, funded by my own labor, filled with people who chose to be there. I had self-respect, hard-won and carefully guarded. 2 years after that scene at the lawyer's office, I stood in my renovated brownstone, hosting a dinner party for friends and colleagues. The house was full of laughter and good food and people who appreciated me for who I was, not what I could provide. Marcus was in the kitchen, charming everyone with his terrible jokes. Lena was arguing good-naturedly with David about investment strategies. Aunt Emma had brought her famous apple pie and was holding court in the living room. My phone buzzed with a text. My mother, asking if we could meet for lunch sometime. No pressure, just if I was open to it. I looked at the message for a long moment, then put the phone away. Not now. Maybe later. Maybe never. But it was my choice, my timeline, my terms. I looked around at my home, at my life, at everything I'd built from the ashes of their betrayal. They'd taught me I was only valuable when I was useful. They'd taught me that success was its own punishment. They'd taught me that love was conditional and family was a transaction. But I'd taught myself something different. I'd taught myself that I was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth putting first. I'd taught myself that boundaries weren't selfishness. They were survival. I'd taught myself that family wasn't about blood. It was about respect and reciprocity and genuine care. They'd wanted to teach me my place. Instead, they'd taught me my worth. And that was worth more than any inheritance, any apology, any reconciliation they could ever offer. I rejoined my guests, accepting a glass of wine from Marcus, and falling into conversation about the renovation project I was planning next. The evening stretched ahead, full of warmth and possibility. Somewhere across the city, my parents were living with their choices. My brother was working on becoming a better person. And I was here, in my own space, with my own people, living a life that was finally, truly mine. They'd called it strength when they abandoned me. They'd called it independence when they ignored me. They'd called it success when they punished me. But I'd taken those labels and I'd transformed them into something real. I was strong, but not because I could endure abuse. I was independent, but not because I'd been denied support. I was successful, but not as justification for my own neglect. I was all those things because I'd chosen to be them on my own terms. Because I'd drawn the line and held it. Because I'd looked at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and I'd said no, not at this cost, never again at this cost. Blood debt paid in blood. They'd bled me for years, drop by drop, dollar by dollar, sacrifice by sacrifice. Now they were bleeding from their own wounds, self-inflicted and undeniable. I hadn't caused their pain. I'd just stopped preventing it. And that, I realized as I laughed at one of Marcus's terrible jokes and felt the warmth of genuine friendship surrounding me, was the difference between revenge and justice. I hadn't set out to hurt them. I'd set out to save myself. Their suffering was just the natural consequence of their own actions, finally catching up after years of being subsidized by mine. I raised my glass when Aunt Emma proposed a toast to new beginnings. I clinked glasses with friends who'd shown up for me without expecting a bill. I took a sip of excellent wine in my own home, bought with my own money, surrounded by my own carefully chosen family. This was what winning looked like. Not destruction, but construction. Not revenge, but reclamation. Not their downfall, but my rise. They'd taught me that you could love someone and still destroy them with your selfishness. I'd learned to love myself enough to walk away from people who only valued me as a resource. They'd taught me that family was supposed to come first, no matter the cost. I'd learned that I was family too, and I deserved to come first in my own life. In the end, they'd given me exactly what I'd always needed, just not in the way they'd intended. They'd given me permission to stop seeking their approval. They'd given me motivation to build something better. They'd given me a crystal-clear understanding of my own worth, forged in the fires of their neglect and sharpened by my own determination. Blood debt paid in blood. The scales were balanced. The transaction was complete, and I was finally, beautifully, impossibly free. The evening wound down eventually. Guests left with hugs and promises to do this again soon. Marcus helped me clean up, moving around my kitchen like he belonged there, and maybe he did. Maybe that was what healthy looked like. People who contributed and cared and showed up because they wanted to, not because they expected payment. Late that night, I stood alone in my living room, looking at the space I'd created. Every piece of furniture chosen carefully, every painting on the wall meaningful. Every corner of this house was mine, and only mine, and that felt like the greatest luxury I'd ever known. My phone sat on the coffee table, my mother's message still unanswered. I picked it up and started typing a response, then deleted it. Started again, deleted again. Finally, I set the phone down and left it alone. Some questions didn't need immediate answers. Some bridges didn't need to be burned or rebuilt. They could just exist in limbo, neither enemy nor friend, just a distant connection that might someday mean something again or might not. I'd spent so many years trying to earn their love, their respect, their attention. I'd bled myself dry trying to be enough. And in the end, the greatest gift they'd ever given me was showing me that I already was enough, that I'd always been enough, and that their failure to see it was their loss, not my deficit. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, to my comfortable mattress in my quiet house and my hard-won peace. Tomorrow I'd wake up and go to work on projects that excited me. I'd have lunch with friends who valued me. I'd make decisions based on what I wanted, not what anyone else needed from me. I'd live my life. And somewhere in the city, they'd live theirs. Separately, distinctly, without my subsidy, without my sacrifice, without my silent suffering propping up their illusions. The debt was paid. The account was closed. The story was over. And my real life, the one I'd built for myself from materials of my own choosing, was just beginning.